I would like to introduce our speaker, Michael Huemer, presenting today on skepticism and the veil of perception. He is a professor of philosophy at CU Boulder. He is the author of more than 60 academic articles in epistemology, ethics, metaethics, metaphysics, and political philosophy, as well as 6 amazing books such as Skepticism and the Veil of Perception, Ethical Intuitionism, The Problem of Political Authority, Approaching Infinity, Paradox Lost, and Dialogues on Ethical Vegetarianism. So Michael, I will let you begin.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that generous introduction, especially for plugging my amazing, wonderful 6 books. So the first book that I wrote was Skepticism and the Veil of Perception, which was sort of based on my dissertation. And basically, the reason why I wrote about this was a couple of things. I mean, one was that when I first got interested in philosophy, it was through Descartes' Meditations, which, basically all philosophy majors are given in their introductory philosophy class, right? And there, Descartes discusses these arguments in the first meditation that are supposed to show that you can't know anything about the external world, right? And by the external world, I mean the world outside of your own mind. And so, by the way, that, of course, includes other people's minds. So you can't know whether there even are any other minds and so on. Obviously, that's not Descartes' actual view. He's discussing these arguments, which he's allegedly going to refute later in the book, but almost everyone thinks that he did not succeed, right? So part of what I wanted to do was to address these arguments for skepticism. And the other reason why I wanted to write this was I was interested in the nature of ethics and or their objective values and so on. And there are these various arguments for moral skepticism and anti-realism. And I noticed that many of the arguments against sort of like the skeptical arguments about morality are parallel to general skeptical arguments that you find in epistemology. The people who are giving these arguments usually don't notice that, but they are. So I thought that, before I work out the nature of morality and how we know about it, I should think about what I think of these general skeptical arguments, right? And then I would be in a position to respond to the arguments about ethics, right? So that's why I worked on that. Now, I'm not sure how much there's arguments for skepticism. So basically, skepticism is usually described as the view that you can't know anything about the external world or something like that. And there's more to say about exactly how to define it, but who cares about that? There are arguments for this position that are surprisingly hard to respond to. And yet, all philosophers think that is the wrong conclusion. I want to come to the conclusion that nobody knows anything about the world around them, right? Like, you don't want to come to the conclusion that you don't know where you live. And you don't, nobody knows whether the earth goes around the sun and the sun goes around the earth or whatever. You don't want to say all those things, okay? But it's kind of hard to respond to these arguments, right? So I will sort of briefly mention what these arguments are. So first, there's the so-called inference argument. So premise, it seems like in order for a person to know something to be true, they must have at least some reason for believing it. It also seems like the reason that they have for believing the thing has to be something that they know. Your reason for believing the thing, you have to know that, so you need a reason for that. And then that also has to be something that you know, so you need a reason for that. That just goes forever. And you can't complete an infinite series, so then the conclusion is that you can't know anything. Okay, obviously this argument is not in fact correct. For one thing, if it was correct, then it would refute itself. because like allegedly I just gave a reason for believing that you can't have a reason for believing anything. So, okay, but that's not really the problem. The reason we talk about this is not that a lot of people think that this might be correct. The reason we talk about arguments like this is it's not obvious what is wrong with it. Right? There's probably something wrong with it, but you know, it's a little bit hard to say what it is. Okay, so and if you can figure that out, that would give us some insight into the nature of knowledge. Right? Okay, there's a second argument which is sort of similar. It's if you form a belief in some way, in order for your belief to be to count as knowledge, you need to verify that the method by which you form the belief is reliable. So if you formed a belief by using sensory observation, then you need some reason to think that your senses are reliable. And if you form belief using the faculty of reason, then you need to know that reason is reliable. And, okay, and similarly, like you have to verify that memory is reliable, you have to verify that introspection is reliable, I guess. That is just going to create another kind of infinite regress problem or a circularity problem or something, because there's no way that you can verify that your cognitive faculties are reliable without using your cognitive faculties, okay? And you don't have an infinite series of different cognitive faculties that you can use, okay? So then the conclusion is that you can't know anything. There's a third argument, which is, so this comes from David Hume, basically. He argues that when you think that you're perceiving the world, you're never actually really perceiving the world. Rather, what you're immediately aware of when you have sensory perceptions, what you're immediately aware of is something going on in your own mind. Like you're aware of a mental image. And then you infer that there's a physical object that's causing the mental image or whatever mental state you're having that's representing the external world. Okay, then Hume basically argues that there's no way of making that inference. So it's not deductively valid, and you can't make an inductive inference either, because you never have immediate awareness of the physical objects. Like there's no way of verifying that physical objects cause mental images of a certain kind if you're never aware of the physical objects. You can only make an inductive inference if you're aware of two things that are correlated with each other, not if you're only ever aware of the one. Okay, and then the last argument is the sort of brain in a vat type argument, which is sort of the style of argument that Descartes gives, although he doesn't talk about brains in vats because he was writing 400 years ago. But it's, basically you can describe a scenario in which you would have exactly the same appearances that you're having now, but almost all of your beliefs would be false. So like you could be a brain in a vat where the scientists are stimulating your brain in the same pattern that it would be stimulated if you were perceiving a real physical world. And maybe the scientists, like they have this sophisticated computer simulation that they're operating, and maybe they decide to put into the simulation this little routine where some guy is talking about being a brain in a vat, just to be amusing. And so that they can have a laugh at you when you think, oh, that's ridiculous, I'm not a brain in a vat. Okay. And then when you think about that, you're supposed to think, first of all, how do I know I'm not a brain in a vat? It looks like you have no way of knowing that you're not. And second, if you don't know whether you're a brain in a vat, it looks like then you don't know anything about the physical world around you. Okay, now, by the way, of course, it's not the case that you don't know anything. Like you can still know that 2 + 2 = 4. That's good. You can still know stuff about your own mind. Like you can know that you're conscious. You can know if you're happy or sad, right? But you can't know stuff about the external physical world, right? Okay, sound great? Anyway, so so all of these arguments, the reason why epistemologists talk about them is not generally that there are a bunch of people who think that they're correct. There's like a very small number of philosophers who think that these arguments are correct. But the reason why epistemologists talk about them is that it's interesting to figure out what might be wrong with them, because they appeal to premises that are seemingly fundamental, obvious principles about knowledge. Like if you're going to know something, you have to have a reason for it. Or if you know something, then you're also in a position to know that things that are incompatible with it are false. right? So like if you know that there's a hand here, then you're in a position to know that you're not a brain in a vat. Like, so these seem to be fundamental principles about knowledge, and then they lead to this kind of crazy conclusion, and we would like to figure out what's going wrong. And if we do, maybe that will give us more insight into the nature of knowledge. So, okay. And then, so my approach to epistemology was I wanted to defend direct realism. This is a view in the philosophy of perception, which holds that, as I define it, it has two sub-theses, right? So the first thesis is we have direct awareness of something in the external world via perception. So when you're having normal perceptions, not hallucinating, you're not suffering from sensory illusions, you're just having a normal perception, then you're directly aware of some external phenomenon. You're not aware of your own mind. And you are aware of something, and it's not in your own mind. Okay, the other thesis is that we have foundational knowledge of something in the external world as a result of sensory perception. Okay, by foundational knowledge, I mean knowledge that's not justified by any other knowledge. Okay, so I'm going to talk about both of those. Okay, so the thing about direct realism. I occasionally encounter people who think that they can easily refute direct realism. In fact, I contributed to a book that was a collection of writings that was supposed to be sort of like a debate between direct and indirect realists. And my experience there was that the indirect realists in that volume thought that direct realism was completely stupid and had been obviously refuted, conclusively refuted by very well-known facts. And also that these people had basically no idea what direct realism was. The reason why they thought it had been obviously refuted was that they had not actually read an actual direct realist, so they didn't know what we're actually saying and what we're not saying. So like my first task is to clarify what that is, right? Okay, so it's the thesis that we have, in perception, we have direct awareness of something in the external world. What do I mean by that? Okay, what's awareness? What is it to be aware of something? Right, well, basically, to be aware of something, you have to have a certain type of mental state, one that, as philosophers say, has intentionality. That is, it's a mental state that is of or about something. So like perceptions are about something, like you perceive a table, the perception is representing the table. There are other mental states that maybe do not have this property. So like if you're in pain, that's not about anything necessarily. It's not representing something. But also if you have beliefs, those are also about something. Right? So to be aware of something, you have to have this type of mental state that is of or about something or represents something. Also, the mental state has to be at least minimally accurate to some object. There has to be a thing in the world that roughly satisfies the content of that mental state. So like if you have a perception of a table, there has to be some table that's roughly the way that it appears to be. In the case of when you have beliefs about the world, in order for you to count as being aware of facts in the world, your beliefs have to be at least roughly accurate. That is true. And then there's a third condition, which is that it has to not be accidental. You have to have gotten things right in a way that's sort of not merely due to chance. Okay, so how does this work in the case of perception? So normal perception counts as a form of awareness. Hallucination, by the way, does not count as a form of awareness. So in response to the question, what are you aware of when you're hallucinating? The answer is you are not aware of anything when you're hallucinating, right? Or at least you're not aware of anything by virtue of having the hallucination, okay? I mean, you could incidentally be aware of things, all right. Okay, so in the case where you're normally perceiving, like, you know, I perceive this pencil, and that I count as being perceptually aware of it because I have a visual experience that's kind of pencil representing, and there's an object in the world, which is the pencil, that at least roughly satisfies my representation. Like it has the correct shape, it's got the right color, you know, it's in the right place or something like that. Also, it's not accidental that my perception is getting things right. It's not accidental because there's a systematic causal connection between stuff in the external world and my experiences, right? And, you know, because I have reliable functioning visual faculties. Okay, so that was the thing about awareness. What about direct awareness? So having direct awareness of something as opposed to indirect awareness. What does that mean? So to be indirectly aware of something is to be aware of something in a way that is dependent upon your awareness of something else. Okay, so for example, I know that there are atoms in the pencil, but I'm not directly aware of the atoms. I'm only indirectly aware of the atoms. And that's because my awareness of the atoms in the pencil is mediated by other awareness. Like I have to know atomic theory. And the way that I would have known that would, like, I have to do a bunch of other stuff. I have to know a bunch of other stuff, which counts as awareness of other facts in order for me to count as being aware of the atoms. I can't just be directly aware of the atoms. Direct awareness is awareness that's not based upon awareness of anything else. All right. So, okay, so when I look at a pencil and I see it in normal conditions, am I directly aware of the pencil or indirectly aware or not aware of it? Well, based on the way that I define these terms, and by the way, I don't think that I'm giving weird definitions, right? I think these are like reasonable definitions, like corresponding to the use of these words in English, okay? The way that I've explained these terms, no, I count as being directly aware of the pencil because the pencil is there. I have a mental representation, which the pencil is roughly satisfying. Like my mental representation is adequate to the characteristics of the pencil, and it's not accidental. And also, it's not based upon awareness of anything else. So like when I see the pencil, the first thing I'm aware of is the pencil. I'm not aware of some other thing from which I then have to figure out that there's a pencil there. Okay, and that last point is just a introspective point, right? Like you don't find yourself inferring that there's a pencil from something else, right? Or being aware of something other than the pencil and then figuring out that there's a pencil there. That doesn't happen. So you're directly aware of the pencil. Okay, now, the indirect realist view is, no, you're always only directly aware of something in your mind. You're never directly aware of the external world. Okay, they have a number of arguments for this, but basically they think that there are these sort of mental images. And so when I think that I'm aware of the pencil, what I'm actually aware of is an image of a pencil in my mind. And I'm just confusing that with a real object, okay? I'll basically explain why I think this is not correct. So, and I should say, by the way, like, and this is one of the things I had to clarify when I had this, debate volume with these, direct versus indirect realists, is that the thesis that I'm putting forward, like, this is not an empirical scientific thesis. It's basically a conceptual point. Basically, I think the mistake that the indirect realists are making is a conceptual confusion, right? Like they think that when you perceive things, you're aware of a mental state, and I think that's just confused. So it's not a matter of like, we need to do some scientific experiments to figure out whether that's true. Okay, why is that confused? Well, in order for you to count as being aware of a mental state, there has to be some like mental thing that has roughly the characteristics that you seem to perceive, right? So like I have the pencil, it looks, I'm having an experience whereby it appears that there's this elongated cylindrical black thing. For that mental state to count as awareness of a certain object, the object has to be roughly round, roughly cylindrical, elongated, and black, or something like that. There's nothing that's at all like that other than the actual pencil, right? Like there's not a mental state that's cylindrical, elongated, and black. Mental states can't have any of those characteristics because those are all physical characteristics, right? So like a state of my mind cannot be cylindrical. So like there's no way in which this experience can count as me being aware of some mental thing. Okay. And this is what I call the argument from spatial properties. It's that when we have normal perceptions, we're aware of things that have spatial properties, like being cylindrical or being in a certain location, and no mental state has any spatial properties. So it can't be that we're being aware of mental states. Okay, what else? I should pause there for a minute and see if there are questions or comments about this before I move on to a different thing. Okay, everyone feel happy with this?
Yeah, a lot of people are muted. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so again, one question for me, let's see. So I'm imagining looking at a TV screen, and even though I'm looking at something that's completely flat, I'm kind of perceiving depth, perhaps because of my, expectations. And so can you speak to how that's related to what you're saying about mental states? It seems like I'm kind of perceiving a three-dimensional object and world while looking at something flat. Is that not happening kind of internal to me?
Yeah, good. So, I mean, this is similar to the famous arguments from illusion. But so, because most of the famous philosophers are really old, they didn't talk about stuff like that, but they talked about illusions. Like, you see the tower from far away and it looks square, but it's actually round or something. Okay, so I'll tell you what we normally say about illusions, and then we can think about how it applies to the TV screen, right? So what we normally say about illusions is, well, you could be aware of an object. It has to have some of the characteristics it appears to have, but it could appear to have some characteristics that it doesn't. So what happens in an illusion is, yeah, you're aware of this thing and like, oh, maybe it appears to have depth, but it doesn't. Okay, now this is why I said, in describing awareness, I said something like, well, the object has to roughly correspond to the way it appears. Meaning it's got to, it has to match some characteristics of your appearance, but it doesn't have to perfectly match. Okay, so you can count as being aware of an object and it can appear to have depth that it doesn't have. Does that sound okay?
I can follow that, yep.
Yeah, so, but now, if the perception gets too far off, then it just becomes a hallucination, i.e. there's no object of awareness. Yeah, I could mention some of the other arguments that indirect realists have given. So yeah, there's this litany of kind of, entertaining arguments, right? So one of them, so this is from David Hume. You're looking at a table, you back away from the table, and as you back away, the table appears to get smaller, as he puts it. But the actual physical table does not get smaller. So therefore, what you were aware of was not the actual physical table. It was only the image in your mind. Okay. Now there's a couple of responses to this, right? Like one thing you could say is, no, it doesn't actually appear to get smaller. It appears to get farther away. And it is farther away. So, there's no illusion there, right? The other thing you could say is, oh, well, maybe it appears to be smaller, but it isn't, but that's compatible with still perceiving a real object, right? It's like, so like that case, that's perspectival variation, like the way something appears depends upon your point of view relative to it, like your location and distance, the angle and distance from which you view it. And I think that's not an illusion. So the correct thing to say, I would say, is it doesn't appear smaller. It appears the same size, but farther away. Like, and by the way, like normal perceivers can tell the difference. Like if you're looking at a table and it actually shrinks, that will look different from if you just get farther away from it. Right? Anyway, okay. But there are actual illusions, right? So there's a thing where you put a stick in water and it appears to be bent, but it's actually straight. Okay, and then the indirect realist is tempted to say, oh, so you're aware of something that's bent and the physical object isn't bent, so it has to be some non-physical object. And the correct response is no. So the only thing that's there is the physical stick. There isn't anything else. Like, I don't know what else it could be that could be bent, right? Mental state cannot literally be bent, like that's a category error, okay? So the only thing to say is, well, you're aware of the actual physical stick, which looks bent, but is in fact straight. Okay, here's another one that they like to say, which is kind of amusing to think about. So you look up in the night sky and you see a star, and actually, it takes thousands of years for the light from the star to get to you, as it might be. And so it may be that the star that you think you're seeing does not exist at the time that you think that you're seeing it. because like it could have been destroyed sometime in the last 1,000 years, and you'd still be seeing that light for, you know, for another 1,000 years. Okay. Right. So therefore, it must be that you're not really seeing the star. Right. A couple of possible responses to this. One is you could say, well, you're seeing the light from the star. Okay, like, you know, the direct realist thesis is you're seeing something in the external world. Doesn't necessarily have to be the star. It could be the light from the star. That's still a physical external phenomenon, not a mental state, okay? The other thing you could say is, no, you're seeing the star, but you're seeing it as it was in the past. So you're seeing this past state of the object. All right, that sounds okay to me. That sounds better to me than saying you're seeing your mind or something in your mind. Okay, what else? Any other thoughts before we talk about
Did you address the question about the television? Did I miss the correlation with what we see on television?
Oh yeah, so I mean, what you might say, oh, that's a case of illusion. So, you know, like you see my image on the screen and it looks like it has depth, but it doesn't really. So maybe, but you're still seeing me. Well, I'm not sure exactly what we'd say. Like, are you seeing me or are you just seeing the picture of me? If you're just seeing the picture of me, okay, you're seeing the screen and the colored light that's on the screen, and you're seeing that totally veridically. Like that, you know, we might say that's not an illusion, like you're correctly perceiving the distribution of colors on your computer screens. Okay. But I was going to mention, like, this brings up that in perception, there's frequently sort of multiple levels of content. There's like the thing that you're most basically seeing. And then there's other stuff that you're kind of seeing in virtue of that. So you're tempted to say that you see me, but you're only seeing me by seeing the screen, right? And the like distribution of colors on the screen and stuff like that. And, you know, if you take it further, you might say, and actually you're only seeing that by seeing the light that's emanating towards your eyes or something, okay? Now the indirect realists go further and say, oh, but you're only seeing the light by seeing your visual experience. And, you know, I'm drawing the line there. You're not seeing your visual experience, right? So, okay. What else? Yeah.
This goes back to the sort of the basic reliability of perception. There's supposed to be a quote by, I think it's Lao Tzu, one of the Chinese philosophers, who says, "Last night I dreamt I was a butterfly, and now I'm not sure whether I'm a butterfly who's dreaming I was a human or a human who dreamt he was a butterfly."
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like this might raise what they call the dream argument in epistemology, right? This is a thing that comes up in Descartes' first meditation where he wonders if he might be dreaming. I mean, I don't know if the butterfly is doing particular work there or if it's just, you know, the general possibility that you might be dreaming. But yeah, so Descartes starts out by saying, oh, sometimes I've suffered sensory illusions, so my senses have deceived me, so I shouldn't trust them. Then he goes, yeah, but, you know, that only happens some of the time when you're in particular circumstances. So as long as I'm in one of the favorable circumstances for viewing when you don't have illusions, I should be okay. And then he says, oh, but wait, sometimes I'm having dreams and I think that I'm in the optimal conditions for seeing something. And like, you know, it appears completely clear that I'm perceiving whatever object, perceiving a unicorn or whatever. But in fact, there is no such object there at all. Right? And, you know, how do you know that you're not dreaming? You know, I think that I actually worried about stuff like this when I was a child, but I just don't worry about that anymore because I actually just don't think that it's hard to tell if you're dreaming. Okay, like if you are actually dreaming, then it might be hard to tell that you're dreaming. But when you're not dreaming, I just don't think that it's hard at all to tell that you're not. Like, I think you just sort of like introspectively determine that you're not dreaming. You know, but like if you don't think that's easy, like here's a couple of other things that you could do, okay? So if you're ever wondering if you're dreaming, first of all, if you're wondering if you're dreaming, you are. Second, if you're wondering if you're dreaming, think about the history before your current experience. Like whatever you're experiencing right now, think how you got to where you were. And then you're going to realize that you can't trace it back, right? If you're actually dreaming. if you're actually awake, you know, it's just, your experience is just connected going back a really long time. And here's another thing I have. This is another trick. This is not really like, you know, a big epistemology issue, but there's another thing that I suggest. Take anything that's written and try to read it. And well, you can't see this, which is suggesting that you might be dreaming, but you're not. You know, I've sometimes, so, you know, sometimes when I had a dream, there would be something written, like I'm seeing a newspaper, and then I try to read it, and you find that you cannot. And the reason you can't is that an actual piece of written text contains a bunch of information that is not in your mind. So, and like, since your mind is inventing everything, it can't supply the words on the page, right? Like, you're just not clever enough to just, you know, compose a book, just like that, you know, just off the, right? One thing that might happen is that the words might change into something else, whatever. Okay, and now I think that that's actually just, that's sort of a special case of a larger observation about dreams, which is, when you have a dream, it does not, in fact, have the amount of information that's in a normal perceptual experience. Like, your senses provide an enormous amount of information constantly. And, you know, to use a computer metaphor, there's not that much bandwidth in dreaming because, you know, your mind is just not that creative to like put all of these details, right? Which is why if you start like focusing in on the particular details, they just don't exist. Okay, anyway, was that helpful? You know, like, I'm not sure that that's actually what Lao Tzu was getting at. Like, I'm not sure that he wanted us to actually just sit there thinking about whether you can tell when you're dreaming. Anyway.
Well, I think he was talking about the sort of the reality that reality is not perhaps what we think it is. I mean, we project. I mean, even the Jungians say that, you know, 90% of our perception is a projection from our psyche, and so it puts the whole foundation of reality on a very shaky ground.
Yeah.
I mean, in Buddhist, I know that one of the Buddhist practices, you were talking about the amount of bandwidth that you have in imagination.
Yeah.
You know, in their meditations, they develop an extraordinary amount of detail in their kind of fantasy world. In their, I mean, it's imagination. They create a landscape. They create a detailed landscape. They go there to meditate in their imagination. So yeah. I'm not sure where the boundary is.
Yeah, actually, I should say, I mean, that thing about imagination, like, well, you can imagine really detailed scenes, but it takes time and work, right? You wouldn't just do it like that, right? So, like, you know, as you were saying that, I was thinking about painters who paint this really detailed scene. It looks just like a real scene, right? But it's not, you're not going to be able to just like make up all the details immediately, which if you're awake, you know, you can immediately access any of these details easily and you don't need any special training or anything. But anyway, like, to the larger point, yeah, I think the larger point is sort of, can we know the true nature of reality, right? And then I think the answer is, well, sort of yes and no, right? Like, we know some stuff, we don't know everything, right? But, you know, like the skeptical view, the skeptics in philosophy, you know, of whom there are very few, but the skeptics basically say, no, you don't know anything about the physical world. Yeah, I think that's wrong, right? And like, so that story about, you know, dreaming that you're a butterfly, and then wondering if you're a butterfly, dreaming that you're a person, I don't think that gives us any reason for doubting our knowledge of the physical world, right? Like, what's the actual reason for doubting? I think I'm perceiving real physical objects. What's the evidence that I'm not, or, you know, the reason for doubting that?
Well, but what's the evidence? I mean, in a sense, what's the evidence that you are? It's clear that the way we've developed as beings, as animals, as whatever, we function on the basis of this apparent reality that we live in. But if you look closely at it, you're not really quite sure what the reality actually behind that is. There was a story by, I can't remember. I mean, he's a well-known writer, but he kind of postulates that what we think we're doing is living this life, and what we're actually doing is some dirty little job in a different universe, and that we have no idea about it. I mean, so.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this might be sort of like the brain in a vat type argument, right? I mean, so like you can tell stories about how things could be different from the way they appear, and yet things could still appear this way. You can tell that story. So then there's a question of like, okay, so does that show anything? Well, like I might think, yeah, so that's just a science fiction stories. Like, I mean, you know, like the fact that you can come up with a science fiction story where I'm wrong isn't evidence that I'm wrong, right? Like, is that a reason why I should doubt my beliefs? Like, I mean, if you had evidence that the story was true, then that's a reason why I should doubt my beliefs. But, right? Which, I mean, by the way, like, I think Descartes' view, like when he was giving these skeptical arguments, I think his view was actually that you need a reason for thinking, like you need a positive reason for doubt. But he actually thought he had positive reasons for doubt. Right? And like what comes out sort of towards the end of the first meditation is that he thinks he has a positive reason for doubting everything because he thinks God is all powerful, and therefore God could plant any image in his mind without there being any reality that corresponds to it, right? And then, but you know, you might think, yeah, but I actually have no evidence for that being true. Okay, I have no evidence for there being that all-powerful being, so, right? Okay, but anyway, but this is a thing that people disagree about. So the skeptics think, no, you have to positively prove that your perceptions are correct. And so all the skeptic thinks they have to do is just come up with some possibility where you're mistaken. And the non-skeptics generally think, no, it's the other way. The skeptic has to give a reason for thinking that our ordinary common sense beliefs are not correct, right? And so, yeah, and then you know, they can't do that, right? In general, nobody's going to be able to prove, like, no one's going to be able to prove the physical world is as it appears, but you're not going to be able to prove that it isn't either, so.
But that's a little bit like saying, prove there's not a God.
Yeah, you know, with the difference that we don't perceive God, right? I mean, that is, it looks as if we're perceiving the physical world, and like, that's why I get to assume that there's a physical world. It doesn't even appear that we're perceiving God, right? Right, although, I mean, that could be disputed. So if there were some religious people here, they would say, no, some people have seen God, right? Like, you know, and so it is an implication of my view that if you have one of those experiences where you think where it seems like you're perceiving God, you have a reason to think there's a God, right? You know, now I've never had such an experience, so I don't have that. I don't have that reason. But anyway.
I've seen God, but I was on acid at the time.
Yeah.
That was just when I was younger.
Yeah.
That's the only time, though.
Good.
So there are people who think that the world that we perceive is a manifestation of God, so they get around it one way or the other.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that might be sort of redefining God, which if you're going to do that, then okay. Right? I mean, like if God is just nature or something like that, then okay, God exists, right? But you know, not the kind that other people are talking about. Right? You know, not the one who wrote the Bible and like, you know, turns people into pillars of salt and stuff like that. Just nature. I agree that exists. Right? But you know, I mean, if the view is no, there's an intelligent being, and somehow all the physical objects around us are manifestations of that intelligent being who's, you know, loving and etc. Oh, okay, but you know, we have to have some reason to believe that. Okay, anyway, so the other major part of direct realism is an epistemological thesis. So all that stuff was about the nature of perception. And actually, after I wrote that book, that part has gotten little attention. There aren't that many people who want to talk about like, okay, whether our perceptual experiences count as direct awareness or awareness at all, whatever. Most of the attention went to the other major thesis that I have as part of direct realism, which is that we have foundational knowledge. Foundational knowledge of some contingent external world propositions, right? Okay, so what's that? Contingent external world propositions. Okay, external world, so propositions are things that could be either true or false. Like there's a table in front of me. External world propositions are ones that are not dependent on your mind, like on one's own mind, right? So for me, propositions about all of you are external world propositions, including about your mind, but also about anything in the physical world. That's all external to me. Okay, contingent propositions are things that could have been otherwise, right? So, and the reason that qualification goes in there is 2 + 2 = 4 might be an external world proposition, but it's like that's not the sort of thing that skeptics are usually trying to put in doubt. They're trying to put in doubt stuff that could be otherwise. Like 2 + 2 = 4 couldn't be otherwise, so big deal that I can know that, right? But there's a table in front of me that could have been otherwise. There could have not been a table or whatever. So, and the skeptics think, yeah, so you can't know things like that. Okay. So anyway, so we could have foundational knowledge about some of these things. What's foundational knowledge? It's knowledge whose justification doesn't depend upon other knowledge. It's not justified on the basis of any other item of knowledge. So how does that work? Okay, so first, there's a view in epistemology known as foundationalism, which basically says that all of our knowledge rests upon foundational knowledge. There's some foundations that everything else rests on, and that's the majority view in epistemology. And why is that the majority view? Because there aren't that many alternative views that you could possibly have, right? Like, what are the alternatives to having foundations that everything else rests upon? The alternatives are circular reasoning, right? Like you have beliefs that are built on something else, and then it ultimately comes back to itself, which does not sound very good. Second alternative, you have an infinite regress. My beliefs are based on something else, which is based on something else, which is based on something else, going on forever. That also doesn't sound very good. Like, that does not sound plausible. Third alternative is don't have any knowledge at all. And then as far as I can tell, those are the only alternatives. Like circularity, infinite regress, no knowledge at all, or knowledge based on foundations, right? And like the first three sound really bad. So that's why most people are foundationalists. Okay, what are the foundations? And like if you have this view, then a super important question is, under what conditions is a proposition foundationally justified? I.e., you get to believe that thing and you don't need a reason for it. Under what conditions does that happen? Okay, and so I have an answer to that. So the answer is what I refer to as phenomenal conservatism. This is a term that I coined in the 2001 book and has now become a popular term in epistemology. So phenomenal conservatism is the view that you get foundational justification for believing something if it appears to you to be the case and you have no reason for doubting it. That's it. Right, so like that's the basis of all of the foundations of knowledge is appearances. That is, if it seems to you that something is the case, there's no reason for thinking otherwise, then it's rational to assume that that thing is the case. Okay, sound good? Okay, and why think that? So, a few things to say about this. What do I mean about something seeming to be the case? So I think this refers to a certain kind of mental state that people have. Like you have mental states that represent things to be the case, but these are different from beliefs. So you can tell that something seeming to be the case is different from your believing it, because it's possible to say, it seems as if so-and-so, but I think that's not actually the case, right? Or also, it is rarely possible to believe something that doesn't seem to be the case. Although if that happens, you're being irrational. Okay, but so an example of this I like to give is, when the Catholics take when they do the communion ceremony, they're supposed to believe that they're eating the body of Jesus and drinking his blood. And it really does not seem that way. Like, when you taste the wafer, it's not going to taste like human flesh. And when you drink the wine, it's not going to taste like blood. So, in an obvious sense, it really doesn't seem like that's the case, but you're supposed to believe it. And so you're supposed to believe it based on something else, which is known as faith, right? So like on my account, faith is believing something not on the basis of appearances. Like it doesn't appear, this thing is not appearing to you, but you're going to believe it anyway for some other reason. Okay, also known as self-deception. So you can, in principle, have a belief that's caused by something other than an appearance, but it's something weird going on, right? There's something like non-rational going on if that happens. Another example is like, you hear that your child has been accused of a serious crime, and you just do not want to believe that. Do not want to believe that he's guilty because he's your kid and you love him. Okay. So then you might believe that he's innocent, not because he appears to be innocent. Like, it's not like that's the way the evidence is pointing or whatever, but because you want to believe that. Right? So if that happens, if the desire is causing your belief, then that's an example where you have a belief that's not based on appearances. Okay, but in the normal case, if you think about all of the cases in which somebody believes something that you would describe as a normal, rational belief, it's based on appearances. So like you come into a room and you see a table in the room and you think there's a table in the room. Okay, that's based on an appearance. It's called a sensory appearance. It's because, you know, when you looked at it, it visually looked to you like there was a table in the room. Okay, so that's a species of it appearing to you as if there's a table. But also you think about, you know, some of them are more intellectual, like what is the shortest path between 2 points? And if you think about it, it's just going to seem like a straight line is shorter than any other path. Okay, and that's not like a sensory appearance, that's sort of an intellectual appearance when you think about it and reflect on it. Okay, now also, you know, the normal operation of memory relies on appearances, they're memory appearances. So you seem to remember something, that's this type of mental state where something is appearing to you to have been the case in the past. Okay, and now if you think about this, you'll realize that when you evaluate the principle of phenomenal conservatism itself that I'm advancing, you evaluate that on the basis of appearances also. So if you're thinking about whether I'm correct about all this stuff, you're going to be thinking about it on the basis of whether it seems correct to you. The people who don't agree with me are the people to whom my principle does not seem correct. And the people who agree with me are the ones for whom it does seem correct. Okay, and you know, as I say, like that's not inevitably the case. I mean, there could be other alternatives, like they could be doing wishful thinking, or they could be taking a leap of faith, right? But no epistemologist will claim to be doing that, right? And that is definitely not what you're supposed to be doing when you're thinking about philosophy, okay? So, you know, if you reflect on it, you'll realize that, yeah, like all the views that people have about this very issue, like whether all beliefs are based on appearances, those are based on appearances. Okay, and so like if you agree that I'm right about that, then you basically should agree that justification is provided by appearances. Otherwise, you're in a self-defeating position. Right, so like if appearances do not provide justification for belief, even when there are no reasons for doubt, then all of your beliefs are unjustified. Right? Because like that's what all beliefs are based on, including your beliefs about this very question, which would mean that your belief that appearances don't provide justification for beliefs would be unjustified also. Right? Okay, so this is what I refer to as the self-defeat argument, that alternative epistemological theories are self-defeating. Okay, I like this argument, and you know, students often like it, but other philosophers have not liked it. Like, you know, the other philosophers like almost uniformly reject it. I'm not sure exactly why. Okay, other thoughts about that? Any comments or questions?
Yeah, isn't every belief or assumption a kind of create a layer of distortion on reality, on whatever other things you try to perceive? And so it sort of self-builds towards a nihilistic, nothing works. I mean, there's no reliable way of perceiving anything.
Why do you say that?
Well, let's say as soon as I have a perception, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm now making an assumption about my reality, and
Yeah.
that assumption itself is a lens through which I'll see everything.
So, I mean, I'm not quite sure I understand how you're using the word assumption. Because, I mean, I would have thought that if I perceive something, I'm not merely assuming. Like in ordinary parlance, like if I saw a table in the room, I wouldn't say I'm assuming there's a table in the room.
Well, but how else would you weigh that perception?
I would just say I saw the table. Like, I mean, you know, say, so let me tell you a short story, right? Like, okay, let's say we're planning a lecture and, you know, somebody says to you, hey, do we have enough chairs in that room? And I go, yeah, we got enough chairs. You say, are you just assuming that? I go, no, I saw the chairs. I didn't just assume it. Right? Like, so, I mean, assume usually in ordinary context means you didn't perceive, right? Or like you didn't have reason for believing, you just like guessed or something. Like, I don't feel like that's what we're doing when we normally perceive things. I don't feel like we're just guessing, right?
Yes, but when you said you saw the chairs, you're still assuming you have enough chairs because you haven't seen the people.
Okay, so you could say, are you assuming that that's enough? And I could go, no, I counted the number of chairs and I also counted the number of people who confirmed that they were coming, right? Or I could tell you the reason why I thought this was enough, and then it would make sense. I'm saying, no, I'm not just assuming that, right? Or like, yeah, okay, the last 12 talks that we had under 50 people. And now we have like 100 chairs, right? So I'm not merely assuming that we have enough chairs, like we clearly have enough, right? I mean, wouldn't that be right?
Yes, yes. I think I'm more like in Eastern philosophy, they talk about Maya, and Maya, it turns out, is what happens when we attach conceptual labels to things, and we invest that conceptual label with our history of that object, and now see it through the lens of all our experience, all our assumptions about it, all our information we have about it, so that the thing itself is becomes a kind of symbolic way of calling up all of the information we have about it, which has now less and less to do with the thing itself.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah. So, I mean, this brings up something about the nature of perception that people have talked about. I mean, like an example that appears in the philosophy of science literature is like a scientist seeing an electron. And like the way that he sees the electron is he sees a path in a cloud chamber, right? Which is, you know, the electron going through the cloud chamber sets off this chain reaction that it emits this, you know, light in a certain path that the electron traveled through. Okay. But, you know, then you have the question, does that count as seeing the electron? I don't know. I mean, but somebody who doesn't know atomic theory would not see the electron, right? Like the same light would enter their eyes, but they wouldn't see an electron because they don't know that that has anything to do with electrons. Right? And that, so, I mean, whether or not that counts, I don't know, like there's a debate about whether that counts, you know, whether you count as seeing the electron or not, okay? But there's a lot of stuff that we think that we see to be true, where you could only see it to be the case if you have some background knowledge. Actually, you know, another one of these famous examples is the duck rabbit. This is an ambiguous picture that looks like a duck or like a rabbit, depending upon how you view it. Okay. And the interesting thing is, if you have never seen a duck, you will not see the duck aspect of it. And, you know, if you've never seen a rabbit, you'll not see the rabbit aspect of it. Okay. And so that is bringing up the fact that like some of the stuff that we say that we perceive is dependent upon background knowledge, okay? So we should sort of distinguish between the stuff that you perceive partly because of other things that you know, and then there's like a basic level of perception that's kind of built in, that's sort of kind of biologically built into the human brain or whatever. Okay, the basic level is probably just perceiving a certain distribution of colors in the visual field, right? So like, you don't perceive that by perceiving something else, but then you do perceive other things by perceiving this distribution of colors, right? So like then you know that there's this computer screen, right? By the way, like I'm not sure if animals perceive the things that are in computer screens, right? Like if you put your animal in front of a TV or computer screen, like it sees the screen. I'm not sure it sees the stuff that the screen is representing. Like I'm not sure it would perceive there being people on the screen. Like if it looked at my screen right now, it might just see there being this box, right? Anyway, and so, you know, that also partly because of background cognitive abilities, okay? But also when people make this point, I sometimes have the feeling that people are making this point to try to impugn the reliability of our perception. But it's actually the opposite, right? Like the fact that we're able to perceive other stuff that's not strictly just in the distribution of colors, that's not a flaw in our cognitive system, right? That's a huge advantage, right? And of course, it's not 100% reliable, but that vastly extends the stuff that we can do. And like, you know, usually we get it right. And like, if you couldn't do this stuff, you'd be kind of screwed in the world, right? Well, yeah, okay. So like, you know, when you see this thing on the screen, you perceive it as a person, and then you have like a whole bunch of other background knowledge about people that gets invoked because of that. Because you know that there's a person and you know a bunch of stuff about people, and then you have expectations about what's going to happen. Like, you know, you make these noises and then you have expectations about the noises that are going to come out of me because of this background knowledge. But that's actually all super good. That's super important that we have that, right? That's not like a flaw in our cognitive system. Anyway, okay, other thoughts?
Michael, one of our past presentations was we watched a little clip from Anil Seth, and he had a TED Talk. And
wait, sorry, from who?
From Anil Seth. His first name was A-N-I-L.
Oh, okay.
And last name Seth, S-E-T-H.
Uh-huh.
The TED Talk was about we are hallucinating. And I actually picked that out, you know, for the presentation because that really spoke to me and made sense to me. But it sounds like you're kind of poking holes in that concept, right?
Yeah, I don't think we're hallucinating. Right, so if you're seeing a pink elephant right now, you're hallucinating. If you're seeing a computer screen in front of you, you're not hallucinating, right? So, I mean, so one thing we want to do is just sort of like there's an ordinary concept of hallucination, and it makes an important distinction. Like the cases in which in ordinary language you say that people are hallucinating are importantly different from what's going on in normal life. And it's like important to make the distinction. Now, I mean, I'm like, without having viewed this video, I'm going to say charitably that he was sort of using a maybe metaphorical use, right?
Well, let me to help you. There was a scientific study that he pointed out that if you put a fake arm in place of your arm, and the person has their real arm underneath, but then there's a fake arm,
yeah,
and then there's like a wall in between.
Yeah.
Something with the experiment, and the person stabs the fake arm, and you freak out because you are expecting to have this sensory reaction of your arm in pain.
Yeah.
So it's something that your mind has presupposed will happen, but it actually didn't happen.
Yeah. I mean, so you can have cases in which you misperceive something, right? So like you mistakenly perceive the fake arm as your arm, and it's not your arm. That does not show that in normal cases, when you actually are seeing your arm, that you're not actually seeing the real object, right? Like, you know, like that scenario in that experiment, that's not happening to us most of the time, right? Most of the time, the thing that looks like your arm is, in fact, your arm. So, so you're, you know, correctly perceiving, right? And so, I mean, part of the direct realist response to a lot of the objections is, yeah, you know, like, I'm not saying like we're correctly perceiving 100% of the time, right? But in normal cases, most of the time we're correctly perceiving. And when you are correctly perceiving things, then you're directly aware of the external object, right? Okay, what else? Other thoughts? Okay, I want to say some things about the arguments for skepticism. Right, so there's this, so there was the infinite regress argument, whereby you say, to know something you have to have a reason for, and then you have to have a reason for the reason, and so on. There's an infinite regress, which you can't complete. And so basically, I think the assumption that in order to know something, you have to have a reason for it is false. In order to know something, so sometimes you know something on the basis of a reason for it, but sometimes you know something because you're just directly aware of it. And if you're directly aware of it, you don't need a further reason for it. Right? Okay, or, more precisely, something appears to you to be the case, and then you don't need a reason for it. Right? You would need a reason for doubting it. Right? Like, in my view, it's not the case that the burden of proof is always on whoever has a positive belief. The burden of proof is on the person who is saying something other than the way things appear, right? The presumption is that things are the way they seem unless there's a reason for thinking otherwise. Okay, what about, okay, the second skeptical argument was this thing about how you have to verify that your cognitive faculties are reliable, and there's no way of doing that. Yeah, so basically, it's basically the same response, right? It's that, now you don't need a positive reason for thinking that. You get to assume that things are the way they appear, unless you have reason for doubting that. So if that's the starting point, then you can get reason for thinking that your faculties are reliable. Right? Like you can get reason for thinking that your vision is reliable because you can go take a vision test, like go see an optometrist, and he'll tell you if you have good vision or something, okay? You can't do that if your starting position is like assuming nothing. Right? But if your starting position is assuming things are the way they appear, then it's okay, right? Then you can get evidence that your faculties are reliable. Okay, but by the way, like there's not really a coherent alternative position, right? Like there's not a coherent philosophy where you say you always need to prove that your faculties are reliable. Because like the person who has that position, how would he justify that position? He's got to justify that position without using any of his cognitive faculties. Right? And like, including reason, right? Or he has to prove that his cognitive faculties are reliable without relying on those cognitive faculties. So it's obviously impossible. Okay, the third argument for skepticism, you've probably forgotten these arguments by now, but the third argument for skepticism was David Hume's argument that basically you only ever perceive the mental states, and there's no way of inferring stuff about the physical world from premises that are solely about your own mind. Something like that. Okay, the response to that is no, we don't perceive our mental states. So we don't have to make that inference. You just start by perceiving the real world. And then the fourth argument was this brain in a vat argument. I think I'm gonna sort of repeat myself, but that's okay. If you have to prove that your faculties are reliable, then you're screwed. So if I have to first prove that I'm not a brain in a vat in order to rely on any other perceptions, then I'm screwed. I can't do it, right? So I'm never going to know anything about the external world. But if I get to start by assuming that things are the way they seem unless I have a reason for doubting it, then I'm fine because I don't have any reason for thinking that I'm a brain in a vat. Like I don't have positive evidence to show that I'm not one, but I have no reason at all to think that I am one. So that being the case, I get to just stick with the presumption that things are the way they appear, which is there appears to be physical objects around me and I don't appear to be a brain in a vat. I appear to myself to be a normal person with like hands and a body and so on, right? That's sort of like the short version of the response, right? Okay, any thoughts about that? Comments or questions?
Looks like Mike's talking, but you're muted.
What?
Looks like Mike is saying something, but he's muted.
I was just thinking that if I was a brain in a vat, I wouldn't be suffering through COVID as much.
Well, yeah, you might think, maybe these scientists are malicious, right? And actually, yeah, the first thing you think is, wow, if somebody was going to create a simulation, they would make it really good, right? This is not really good. Like, you could do way better than this, make it a lot more fun, right? And then you think, oh, but, well, maybe they're malicious, you know, they're just like trying to mess with us.
Sadistic scientists.
Yeah, but then if that's the case, it should be a lot worse, right? Like, you know, if they're sadistic, they should be, we should be being tortured all the time. So then, okay, then you think, well, so what else could be their motives? But it's like, it's hard to think what the motives of the scientists would be so that things would look exactly as if there weren't any such scientists, right?
If you ask the QAnon people, they know.
Yeah, they're into the conspiracy, right? But by the way, I mean, you know, like, speaking of atheism, I mean, this is related to God, right? So, you know, sometimes the religious people say, well, you have to have God to explain why there's this nice world that sustains life or whatever. Okay, but the thing is, like, well, if God likes life, there should be a lot more of it, right? Like, the universe should be just packed with life because he's all powerful. He can just put it everywhere. So then you try to come up with some other motivation for the creator, right? But it's like, there's no motivation you can come up with so that things would look like this, right? Like, things would look exactly as if it was just a total accident. Unless, I don't know, maybe his motivation is he wants to convince us that everything is a total accident, right? Like, and so then he would make things look like this, right? It's like, if he likes life, there would be more life. If he doesn't like life, there would be less life, right? If he likes beauty, then there would be more beauty. It would be all over the place, right? If he likes ugliness, there would be more ugliness, right? There's nothing that's being maximized here, except like just stuff happening randomly. So, right. Similarly with the brain in the vat people. Anyway, that was something of a digression there.
Mike, did you have a question?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if you guys, I guess it's a little like the brain in the vat thing, but have you addressed the idea that everything we're seeing and doing and interacting with people, everything is a dream?
Yeah, I mean, that was mentioned. Yeah, it was mentioned earlier. I mean, I think if you mean dream, like in the ordinary sense, like, you know, the stuff that I've experienced when I've gone to bed at night, I think I know that I'm not dreaming now, right? Like, you know, the various ways in which normal dreams differ from my current experience, okay? Like, you know, I mentioned, like, well, there's a lot more detail in my visual field than there normally is in my sensory experiences. Also, like, I remember how I got here, and like, I can trace back my history a long way from this current experience, right? I remember getting up in the morning to get here and all that. Right. But, you know, you might say, oh, well, maybe there's like a more extreme hypothesis, which is like, maybe everything is a dream. So your beliefs about what dreams are typically like are false.
Yeah.
Because the things that you call dreams were not actually dreams. They were like dreams within a dream. Right?
Yes.
So I'm mistaken. All right. Then you go, okay. And so that I think is like, it's like the skeptical, it's like sort of like the brain in a vat, in that there's no reason to think that. Right, like the regular dream scenario, you might think there's some reason to think I might be dreaming, because at least I've had that experience in the past. There's been at least some times when I was dreaming. But when you have this sort of super dream scenario, where it's like, okay, there could be a dream that's exactly like a waking experience, and like it goes on for 50 years or whatever, then I start to feel like, yeah, there's no reason to think that. So.
Just because there's no reason to think that, that would just mean we've gotten used to this long, detailed dream, and we don't have any reason to think it because we've always experienced it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
so how would you deal with that?
Yeah, and so, I mean, the issue is sort of like the skeptics think that you have to give a positive proof of everything, of every belief, everything. Like, you have to give positive evidence for it. And then when you give the evidence, you have to give the evidence for that. So it just goes on. Okay, and the non-skeptics generally think, no, you have to give a reason for doubting that things are the way they appear. Like, you just start out thinking everything is the way that it seems. And then if somebody gives you a reason for doubting that things are the way they seem, then you reconsider it, right? But if there's no reason for doubting it, then you don't, right? Okay, so like, that's how I think about that scenario. Like, no, just like, somebody just saying something is a possibility doesn't give me a reason for thinking that it's the case. So, right. You could think about, by the way, like, think about when people are evaluating scientific theories, right? And, you know, you can always come up with some radically different scenario, okay? So like, oh, you know, it looks like the Earth is rotating and orbiting the sun, but, you know, maybe God is just like pushing the planets around the Earth, and he's pushing them around in exactly the pattern that we see in the night sky, and so the Earth is stationary. It's like, okay, if you can just come up with any logical possibility, and there doesn't have to be any reason to think it, then like every theory is destroyed, right? Like, you know, you can always say, oh, maybe it's some other thing, right, in which you can't refute. Okay, we can't refute that God's doing that, but, right, like, why would we think that?
And I think the group that's come up with this spaghetti monster as a possible God, that's exactly, they're just throwing something out there like, well, why not this?
Yeah.
And so it kind of plays into the fact that you can't just throw some possibility out there without giving proof that it is that way versus the way we see it.
Yeah, Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster.
Yes, may his noodly appendages touch you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so, like what the skeptics would say is, oh no, you know, I'm not like the religious people, because like, I'm not saying that this thing is actually true. I'm just saying like nobody could prove anything. So we just have to withhold judgment on everything, right? So like the skeptic's view is, oh, the burden of proof is always on like anyone who asserts anything, right? In my view is, no, the burden of proof is on people who think that things aren't the way they seem to be. Right? Like the presumption is things are the way they seem. Right?
Okay.
That's a good bumper sticker. I like that for a bumper sticker.
Yeah.
Something I wondered, because you keep bouncing back to it, is you have no reason to believe things are other than what we perceive. Does that come out of some philosopher's thinking, or where did you get that constant refrain?
For me, but yeah. I mean, you know, it's just sort of like the dialectical situation, right? So, like the skeptic just throws out logical possibilities and says, here, you have to prove that that's not the case. And then, and by the way, like, you know, this thing that I'm saying is widely accepted in epistemology, like that the crucial issue is, do you have to show, do you have to prove that the scenario is not the case, or does the skeptic have to give you a reason for thinking it is the case? Like, it's widely accepted that if you say that you have to refute the skeptical scenario, then the skeptic wins, like game over, right? It's like, it's just clear that it's not going to work after that. But if the skeptic has to give evidence for that scenario, it's also widely accepted that then the skeptic loses, right? Like nobody thinks that you can give evidence that you're a brain in a vacuum. So, I mean, I don't have a specific person that this comes from. I just think this is like a widely held view in epistemology.
It's when you're saying all this, the first place my mind goes is to the only philosopher I really like enough to keep his teachings in my head, which is René Descartes. Are you familiar with his argument from a ball of wax?
Yeah.
So I think of things that way, you know, how does he know he's really perceiving that ball of wax? How does he know this isn't all a dream inside his own mind?
Yeah. By the way, like, so side point, I don't think this is what you're getting at, but the point of the ball of wax example was it's supposed to illustrate the existence of
what is the ball of wax example, please?
Yeah, so he has some piece of wax on his desk or whatever, and you can melt the wax and all of its visible properties change. So like the color will change, and then like it'll go from solid to liquid, and the size and shape will change and all that. And he still thinks it's the same wax. Okay, and so I mean, I think the main point he was actually trying to make was about there's a thing called substance. You should believe that there's a substance which is distinct from the properties of the object, because there's something that's still there, right? There's something that's the same even though all of the apparent properties of the object have changed. Like in some sense, it's still the same object. And so what you should say is it's because it's the same substance. And so you should believe that substance is independent of the properties of the object or whatever. Today we would say it's the same matter, made of the same matter, even though it has, you know, different macroscopic properties.
You remember his argument for saying that the ball of wax wasn't just what he perceives as a ball of wax?
Yeah, yeah.
In other words, I'm dreaming I'm holding a ball of wax. How do I know I'm not dreaming that? How do I know I'm not deluded?
Yeah. The infamous dream argument. But so just like, you know, as a last comment, like the point that was made, so first there was a metaphysical point that there's this thing called substance. And then he was making this sort of rationalist point, which is, oh, how do I perceive the substance? Like, why do I know that there's substance there? And like, what you're supposed to think is, I knew it with my mind intellectually, because you don't perceive the thing with your senses. So like, you know intellectually that there's this thing. Okay, and that's because he's like a big time rationalist and wants to sort of champion the power of reason, okay? But that didn't answer the dream argument, right? And
actually, it sort of did.
Yeah.
For those who aren't familiar, he's using the ball of wax observation, and his thoughts on it lead to the cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, his most famous quote. So did you want to summarize a little of how we get from looking at it to I think, therefore I am?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say exactly that we got from the one to the other. It's just like, so what you're supposed to think is you have this sort of intellectual intuition that properties require an underlying substance, and like you don't need empirical evidence for that. You just have to like think about it and understand it, and then you'll just see intellectually that it's true. The cogito thing, actually it doesn't appear in the Meditations, it appears elsewhere. And that's where, so you give all these skeptical arguments where you describe scenarios in which things would appear the way that they actually do, but your beliefs would be mistaken. Okay, and so you try to come up with these scenarios to cast doubt on everything that you can, and then you realize that there's only so far that could go. So you realize that there could not be a skeptical argument that would cast doubt on your own existence. Because the skeptical argument, again, is an argument in which you describe a scenario in which things would appear the way that they do right now, but your beliefs would be mistaken. But there could not be a scenario in which things appear the way that they do right now, but you don't exist. Because like if you didn't exist, nothing would be appearing anyway to you, right? And also there couldn't be a skeptical argument casting doubt on your beliefs about how things appear, right? Because like it would have to be a scenario in which things appear the way they presently do now, but you're wrong about the way things appear, right? So like they would have to appear this way, but not really appear this way, which doesn't really make sense. Okay, anyway, so, so then you get the conclusion that there can't be a reason for doubting your own existence or your beliefs about how things appear. Right, but I mean, notice that the way that Descartes is thinking about this, he does not assume that you have to give positive evidence for all of your beliefs, right? Like the thing about the cogito, like it's sometimes treated as if he gave a proof that he exists, right? But if you think that through, and like as Thomas Reid pointed out, like the proof isn't that great, right? So you could say, I think everything that thinks exists, therefore I exist. But then like, why do you get to start from the premise, I think? And
because
but
you're
you don't
perceiving something.
What?
Because you are perceiving something with specific properties. And since there's something perceiving and something being perceived, that means that there's a thinking thing to perceive it and understand that.
Yeah, so like the premise is, I think, and so you're saying the premise is there's some perception. And then from that you get, I think. And by the way they use the word think is broader than the way we usually use it. So it's a valid inference, right? Like think just means you're having some conscious experiences or something like that. So it's valid to say I had a perception, so I'm thinking. Okay, but then what's the proof that you had a perception? Right? And like, oh, by the way, if you just start from perception exists, then you don't get to I exist. You just get to, you know, so there's just some perceiving going on. Like,
Yes.
maybe there's somebody perceiving. Okay, but like, and my point is not that it's doubtful that you exist, right? That's crazy. It's just that, like, you know, like the premise, if this is supposed to be a proof, like the conclusion is just as obvious from the start as the premise. So you might as well just start from I exist, right? It's like, it's not more, okay, but also Descartes actually made comments to this effect that he wasn't trying to present a syllogism, right? So like there's this discussion where, you know, after the meditations, there's a series of objections and replies. So it's somewhere in there where he says, like, I wasn't trying to give a proof. I was just like giving expression to the self-evident awareness of your own existence or something like that. Okay, but anyway, what I forgot where I was going with that. Oh yeah, okay, but notice that the way Descartes is thinking about skepticism is not that you have to first prove everything. Like, it's not that you don't get to believe any proposition unless you can give a proof for it, right? Which again, if you start from that position, you never get anywhere. If that's your starting position, that's also your ending position, because you have no premises to start from. So there's no way you're going anywhere, okay? But that's not what he thinks. What he thinks is you start from a certain set of beliefs that you have right now, and then a skeptic can try to give reasons for doubting it. And like if you read the meditation, if you read the first meditation carefully, you'll see that that is actually what he's saying. He's saying that there's some reason, right? Like not necessarily a very strong reason, but there's at least some reason for doubting a whole bunch of your beliefs. And then what happens in the second meditation when he says, but you know, I still know that I exist, is he realizes that none of those reasons could be construed as a reason for doubting that you exist. There's no way somebody could give a reason for doubting that you exist. It's not that I've got a proof that I exist. It's that there couldn't be any reason for doubting it. So I get to just keep that belief, right?
Yeah, and as I recall the argument, he was basically trying to do something that would be considered a bit absurd, which was strip everything down to the level where he was trying to see if he could prove nothing exists. And he didn't succeed, but at the same time, he proved that something exists. And then from there, he started trying to rebuild the world. So he was carrying on an absurd exercise, but in part just to do what, in part just to do what Michael was saying, to come up with a proof from practically zero. Not because you always have to do it, but he thought, what the hell, I'll give it a shot.
Yeah. And, you know, by the way, like, you know, I don't know if other people have read this, you know, it's Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, which is sometimes considered to be like the foundation of modern philosophy, right? Sometimes described that way, although perhaps unfairly, I don't know. Anyway, and then like what's supposed to happen? Okay, first he proves that he exists, and then he proves that he knows how things appear to him. So he knows the content of his own mind. And then he's got to prove that God exists. Right?
Yeah.
And then he's got to argue that God would not be a deceiver. And so therefore, if my sensory faculties were radically unreliable, you know, God would be a deceiver. That's impossible. So my faculties have to be basically reliable, right? And so then I'm going to get back the rest of the physical world. And like the end of that's not right. That doesn't work.
Was that just a statement?
I remember that part was pretty bad.
There were. Sorry, there were too many people talking.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Say that again, Jenny. Go ahead, Jenny.
I'm curious. You said that God is not a deceiver, that was part of the argument, and I'm wondering whether there was some basis for saying that God is not a deceiver, or whether that was just an axiom.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the basis is that God is a perfect being, and deception is incompatible with perfection.
Oh, I see. Now I understand. Thank you.
God is defined to be a perfect being, right? And then there's like, he has this version of the ontological argument.
Well, what about Loki? Loki was God.
Yeah.
I think he's like the best description.
Yeah. I mean, so, you can't prove that Loki exists, allegedly.
I have more feeling of that that's true than the other.
Yeah. I mean, so like, you can't prove that any of these exist, but he thought that you could prove that, so like the traditional Judeo-Christian God existed, but you couldn't prove any of these other ones, right? And the reason was that like the God he believed in was defined to be a perfect being. And then there's like this argument that a perfect being has to exist. It's like the argument is like a conceptual confusion, okay? But, it is like drawn in some smart people, right? Where he says, oh, because it's like a perfect being, and like existence is part of perfection. So like it has to exist.
But it sort of seems like it's a circular argument to me, because who's to say that that's the standpoint from which we're defining this God thing is the position that we're operating from, and that is not necessarily perfectly correct.
Yeah. Well,
but you probably don't want to defend his proofs of the existence of God, most likely.
Yeah, I mean, they're clearly not correct, but
Well, I remember when I read that, at the time I was a Christian, and I thought that the arguments were so flimsy that it just completely fell apart.
Yeah. And there's some quotation that now I've forgotten, but it was something to the effect of, nobody doubted the existence of God until so-and-so tried to prove it. It was like somebody who gave lectures trying to prove the existence of God. And then, people listened to the lectures and they were like, those weren't very good. Maybe there's no God. Which, that sort of thing almost never happens, but that should happen. Like sometimes if you hear the case for something, sometimes it should convince you of the opposite. Because if the argument for a conclusion is weaker than you would have expected that it would have been, then you should lower your credence in the thing, right? So if the arguments for God are weaker than you thought they were, you should lower your credence, even though it's an argument for God and not against it. Okay, other thoughts?
Yeah, I've got one. So there's a model of the perception process that I've sometimes found useful, and it includes 4 components. Selection. So you take in a lot of sensory inputs, and you sort of take some and you leave some, right? You don't necessarily incorporate everything that you're taking into your perception. So selection is the first part. Organization, so defining the relationships between the information that you've taken in. Interpretation, ascribing meaning to it. And then negotiation, which, if you're with someone, you might bounce your interpretation, your perception off of theirs to see if you can kind of come to a shared understanding. And so it seems like each of those processes, each of those parts of that perception model can add some subjectivity into at least what we would report is what we've perceived. And so in that context, when you're talking about perception, and when I'm thinking about it, when it comes to kind of the simplest forms of perception, perhaps there's some objectivity associated with that. But when it comes to perceiving larger collections of objects or more complicated forms, as they go through that selection, organization, interpretation, negotiation process, it seems like it introduces some subjectivity. And so, So I guess, I'm wondering if there's kind of a midway point between the suggestion that you're either kind of purely skeptical of things or purely permissive, and that kind of the more complicated the thing that you're trying to perceive, the more skeptical you should be, because it's going through all those processes to be understood.
Yeah, so I mean, I want to expel the last stage in there. I don't think negotiation is part of perception. Okay. I mean, like, there might be this thing where, like, that might happen, but that's not part of cognition, right? Like, other people are disagreeing with me, but then there's sort of like non-cognitive, sort of evaluative factors that are influencing you. Okay. But anyway, I mean, most of the things that are happening in that process are they're in some way cognitively beneficial, and that's why they exist. It's like the selection. So sort of like you don't attend to everything that's available in your visual field, right? Or the whole perceptual field. Yeah, so one thing that will happen sometimes is like I'm in the supermarket and I'm looking for something, I'm standing in front of the shelves and there's like a bunch of stuff, right? And I don't see the thing that I'm looking for. And then after a while I see it and it was right in front of me, right? And I didn't see it. I sort of saw it. It was in the visual field, right? But in another sense, I didn't see it because there was just too much other stuff around, okay? But I mean, the fact that there's something in your brain that selects stuff out for attention. And it's not exactly that you do this because you don't exactly choose. I mean, you can sort of choose what to attend to, but you also, you know, like you can't choose not to attend to some things that are really striking, okay? So there's some process in your brain that's deciding what things are important for you to attend to, but I wouldn't really describe that as introducing subjectivity. I would just say like, there are adaptations in your brain, which actually it's really good that you have them because they cause you to attend to the stuff in the physical world that's actually important, right? Like suddenly there's a loud noise, and usually in life, if there's a really loud noise, it's important just to find out whatever is making that noise. It could be a threat or whatever. Right, but it's like, you know, you have the experience because there actually was that thing, right? And then, you know, there's the part where you interpret, but you bring to bear background knowledge. But again, that's not like a distortion of your perception. That's like augmenting your perception, right? So there's the stuff that is available right now, but then there's stuff in your brain that combines the information that's in front of you right now with other things that you know. Right? And like that doesn't stop you from perceiving reality objectively. That helps you perceive more of reality.
I would suggest that it helps you perceive reality through a familiar lens, and that there may be changes to reality that you wouldn't necessarily observe or notice because they don't filter well through that same lens.
Yeah. And I mean, actually, one of the things you said was sort of like the more, actually, I forgot what it was exactly, but the more complex it is or the more indirect your perception is, the more doubt you should have. And that is true, right? But like the things that people would normally describe as perception are highly reliable. It's the things that people normally describe as theories or their beliefs or the things that other people would call your ideology, your religion, your philosophy, all that stuff. All that is super unreliable, right? So that, yeah, if you go into a room and you say that you saw some stuff, almost 100% of the time, what you say you saw was what was there, okay? But like, we're super unreliable when it's like, I don't know, like, oh, I heard a news story and now I'm inferring what happened, right? Or like, I have this belief about what policy should be and it's based upon a whole bunch of other stuff where I'm making inferences. Yeah, that's really unreliable.
Actually, I think that news reporters, would challenge your idea that the observation of reality is kind of a consensual process, because they'll talk to 5 different people that saw something dramatic happen, and they'll get 5 different stories, and sometimes dramatically different stories. So I'm not quite convinced about this objectivity of observed events.
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, we'd have to look at particular cases, I think, right? Because so sometimes the people who would be talking to the reporter would just be lying because they have an interest in the case. Like if a crime occurred and you talk to the person who was accused of committing the crime, they give a different story from other people because it's in their interest to give a different story, right? But also another thing that happens is people saw different aspects. They saw different parts of an event, or they saw different events, right? So like one person saw what happened in the beginning, another person saw what happened in the end, or something like that. And that could be part of why they have different experiences or like different things to say. Yeah, there's also like, so I don't think this is what you're talking about. There's also though the problem of, you know, afterwards, after somebody saw something and they try to identify a person, if they don't know the person that they saw, they're not so good at identifying them. So if you see somebody that you know well and you see them commit a crime, then you're going to correctly report. But if you see somebody who you've never seen before commit a crime, then you're frequently unreliable at identifying that person later. Right? So like, you know, there's empirical evidence on that. And like if the police show you a lineup and the actual perpetrator is not in the lineup, then it's pretty likely that you will pick the person in the lineup who looks closest to the perpetrator, right? Who's most similar to the perpetrator, but wasn't actually them. And so like, that's a way that you can get false convictions and stuff. Yeah, what else? You know, a lot of the stuff that gets reported is not just reporting what physically happened. Like it's weird if two people saw something at the same time in the same place and they have very different descriptions of the physical events. But it's very common. Sorry, what?
I said that happens a lot. Ask any cop who comes up and asks for witnesses what happened in an accident. And you'll have people saying, well, that car came at this angle and the truck hit him in the rear, and then they both spun and the truck overturned but got back on its wheels, etc. And the other one's like, no, the truck never tumbled. And, you know, this person didn't go through the intersection. The truck swerved. So it's obvious that they saw the same thing, but they didn't know where the truck went, where the car went, and so far. It's, you know, they saw the same thing. Maybe they were standing right next to each other. They just could not straighten out their stories.
I'm not sure what would be going on there. I'm not sure that I've seen any such case.
Oh, go to any police report on accidents. You'll see a lot of it.
I mean, you know, so I think some of the things that happen are like somebody wasn't paying attention, but they decide to answer the questions anyway, right? Or like they don't actually know the answers to the questions, but they answer them anyway. Like that's a thing that sometimes happens, I think. And
the usual psychological explanation of it is that people have trained themselves to perceive certain things. If you've trained yourself to see colors and the emotions of people around and such, but you haven't trained yourself to perceive fast actions accurately, you're not going to be a good witness for a traffic accident.
yeah,
On the other hand, you can have somebody like me who's trained to perceive actions in an event. I'll see it pretty accurately, but I have no idea what color the street lamp was.
yeah,
So it's training that affects your perception.
yeah. Sounds right. You know, there's like, I mean, as I think you mentioned, there's also like what you're paying attention to. So if you don't care about the color of the street lamp, then you probably are not going to remember it, right? Although, like if somebody asked you at the moment, then you could tell them. But later, you know, they ask you after the whole thing's over what color it was, and you didn't pay attention at the time, you're not going to remember.
Right. And again, that's what's important. I think it's important to see what happened in the accident.
Yeah.
Because that's what the police really need to know in the end.
Right.
And it's why you've got people who have studied the science of reconstructing events after the fact.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, another thing you mentioned is, well, like if you have a traffic accident, it probably happened really quickly. So, you know, people can easily not get what happened in a very short time.
Yeah, like I say, it's training. You know, the simple example for me, if you and Tom got into a fight, Cheryl would probably not be able to very well describe what happened in that fight.
Yeah.
because it's fast, it's furious. I, on the other hand, who've studied martial arts for decades, would probably be able to come back and say, Tom took the first swing and then Michael ducked it and hit him in the gut. And I could do all of that. I'm used to perceiving it.
Mike, don't underestimate me.
This is hypothetical.
But, I mean, so, thing that I want to point out
I think
about
Cheryl will
this
break it up immediately.
I would protect Tom in every circumstance.
Then I'd be witnessing you getting
Yes, I
hit in the nose.
So, I mean, what I want to point out about this is like, the fact that like your training would affect how you perceive things is a good thing, right? It's like, I mean, it's sort of like the things that people say as examples of how our perception is partly subjective or something are actually just examples of how our perception is adaptive, right? That is, our brain adapts itself to what we need. And so like it will focus on the stuff that we need to know and like throw out the stuff that we don't need to know. It will sort of like add interpretations that are based upon our background knowledge, right? That are relevant and, that are about things that we want to know, right? And, so as long as the rest of what's going on in your mind is going well, then that's good, right? Like if you have a bunch of crazy background beliefs, then it's going to screw you up. But if your background beliefs are generally reasonable, then it's going to help you. And, you can train yourself to better perceive things that are important to you, and then you're going to get better at that. There
was a film, this is quite an old film, a Japanese film called Rashomon. And Rashomon was a trial, a murder trial. And they had 6 different witnesses and they called one witness from the dead. And each witness proceeded to tell the story of how actually they were the ones who were guilty and should be punished. And the point of the film was that our perception is very suspect and is very, let's say, adaptive. And the adaptations aren't necessarily to our benefit, because each of them had seen themselves as the one who should be guilty of the crime.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's relevant that that's a fictional story, not a real story. Like part of why that sort of story would be cool is precisely that isn't what would happen. I mean, like the stories that are exciting are often stories about things happening that are counterintuitive, because like what's intuitive is everybody's going to say they didn't do it. And so that's why it's exciting to have a story where everybody says that they did do it, right?
Well, but I think that simply underlies the fact that each of their perceptions was independent of their own. I mean, I think that often happens, that the perception isn't necessarily just for your own survival or for your own benefit. It's really distorted by your history and by the way you perceive things and how you classify the world around you. Yeah.
I mean, it could be distorted or it could be enhanced by your history and et cetera, right? It's like, I've had other experience in the world. Why shouldn't I use that, right? Mm-hmm. Like what you rationally should do is take into account all the information you have, including information that you acquired in the past before right now, right?
But what you're saying is enhanced, I would say is distorted.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it could be either.
Yeah, depends
so
on.
Let me interrupt now. We've only got 3 more minutes. This has been great discussion. Michael, I'm assuming if people have questions on this topic, they can go to your book, and you've probably outlined everything very nicely in your book, right?
It's a great book. Here it is. I don't have the paperback, so it just looks like a black thing. But anyway.
What's it called?
Oh, Skepticism and the Veil of Perception. And by the way, here's some of my other books. There's that one. Oh, you can't see this because I've turned on this weird background thing. But there's some of my other books.
So if you want to go to meetup.com where this event is posted, it gives a nice summary of Michael's other books. And we may ask you to come back, Michael, and present on one of your other books.
Sounds good.
Well, thank you, everybody. Unless somebody has one last minute question, I think we could wrap this up.
Sure, we just got a few seconds. Tell me the nature of truth.
Truth is correspondence between a representation and reality.
Thank you, Michael.
Hey,
Thank you,
That's
Michael.
another good bumper sticker.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay,
Michael, bye.
great talking to you all. Good meeting you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.